exploring biases and philosophy's role in expanding understanding and perspective.
And I became aware of this bias. I didn't know I had it until this moment when I opened the door and found myself surprised that the workers were white. And at this moment, I was like, oh my, like I didn't even realize that I had had this bias, and I was embarrassed about it, but I was so glad that I had been made aware of it, as uncomfortable as it was, right? So it had been there all along and I didn't even know, right? And so these are the kinds of moments I'm talking about. Perhaps you've had them in your life, right? Where we realize that, a lot of what we've been told was maybe false, right? Or at least, was not the whole truth, right? It was a generalization, a stereotype. And so again, we want to make sure that we don't allow any old belief to reside in our mind. You should know what beliefs you hold, and you should agree to have them, right? And for good reason. And so if you're not willing to do this, right, then he says, to such a person, the world tends to become definite, finite, obvious. Common objects rouse no questions, and unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. So here what he's saying is if we're not willing to question our prejudices, if we're not willing to question common sense, basically you're going to be the kind of person who thinks they have everything figured out. Maybe you know someone like this. They think they know everything. They have all the answers. And I want you to think for a moment about how enjoyable it is to be around someone like that, right? We don't like people who act like they know everything because no one knows everything, right? And so we want to, again, try to embrace that intellectual humility. All right, so how does philosophy work, right? How is asking questions going to help, free us from this prison, as Russell's talking about? Well, he says as soon as we begin to philosophize, right, opposite to the person who thinks they know everything, we find that even the most everyday things lead to problems to which only very incomplete answers can be given. For example, right, I might think about something really common like brushing my teeth, right? Seems like an everyday thing, not very problematic. But when I start really thinking about it in a philosophical sense, right, I might think about, okay, well, as an action, surely it has some sort of consequences. So let me think about the outreaching impacts of me brushing my teeth. Well, in order to even be able to brush my teeth, I had to get my toothbrush from somewhere, right? So we're thinking about, materials, natural resources perhaps, or artificial ones. We're thinking about manufacturers, the employees, perhaps the environmental toll of shipping certain products. If I'm talking about a hygiene product like toothpaste, we're talking about animal testing at least, as well as, the place that I bought my toothbrush and toothpaste from. They probably have labor practices that are, either good or not so good. They pay employees a certain wage. They treat them a certain way. And then, of course, any runoff from the actual act of brushing my teeth or disposing of things. So, it might not seem like at first glance that brushing my teeth really involves anybody else, but then we start to think about it and we actually realize that a lot of people are involved. So, shoot, now do I have to make sure that I get a recycled toothbrush and make sure that the toothpaste that I get is not tested on animals and maybe is made locally. Like, this can be very frustrating, right? You can see why people don't enjoy asking these philosophical questions. Now, I don't want, again, that sort of thing to make us frustrated. I don't want it to paralyze us, right, with inaction. But the idea is that somewhere in this process of breaking open this can of worms of questions, Russell thinks the value of philosophy lies, right? So he says here, philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. Okay, so in one way or another, if our life is to be great and truly free, we must escape this prison of our private world, right? So here's where this reading can get especially tricky, right? He starts talking about the self and the not self, right? Again, so philosophers sometimes use technical or specific language to talk about things that maybe we would know by another name or description. So here, right, Russell is breaking up this dichotomy some more, right, between someone who engages in philosophical contemplation and someone who does not, right? And so by asking those questions, because we don't know what the one right answer is, we are forced to explore as many possible answers as we can and to assess the strengths and weaknesses before we make a decision. And so the idea is that if I decide today what the answer to a question is, well, I'm going to be done exploring the possible answers. Whereas if I don't decide, for a month or maybe even a year, I'm going to learn so much more, right, by continuing that exploration. And so what he is actually encouraging us to do is almost remain agnostic in a sense, right, to maintain that uncertainty in the sense that we should not necessarily never think that we know what the right answer is, but at least always be willing to be open to new possibilities, right? That we should never shut ourselves off from a future, potentially better or more accurate answer, right? So true philosophic contemplation finds its satisfaction in every enlargement of not just the world, right? Because we are getting a sense of what the world is like, right? The not self part. But he says also, right, it finds its satisfaction in everything that magnifies the objects contemplated and thereby the subject contemplating, right? So by opening your mind, right, he almost says that you're making yourself larger, right? You're enlarging yourself in this way. And everything then in contemplation that is personal or private, everything that depends upon habit, self-interest, or desire, just distorts the object, right? And hence impairs the union which the intellect seeks, right?